It all began in 1607. A group of English settlers crossed the Atlantic and landed in Virginia. They called their new home Jamestown, the very first permanent English settlement in America. But life here was anything but easy. Hunger, disease, mosquitoes, and constant tension with the local Powhatan people nearly wiped them out. In that first year, more than half of the settlers died. It seemed like the colony might not survive. Then came Captain John Smith. With his strict rule, "He who works not eats not," and the help of Chief Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, Jamestown pulled through. Soon, tobacco farming gave the colony a way to grow and prosper. Fast forward to 1620. Another ship set sail across the ocean, the Mayflower. On board were the Pilgrims, people who wanted freedom to practice their faith. While still at sea, they signed an agreement called the Mayflower Compact, a pledge to govern themselves. It was the first seed of self-rule in America. But when they finally landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, winter was brutal. Hunger and sickness killed nearly half of them. Survival seemed impossible, until the local Wampanoag people stepped in. They taught the Pilgrims how to farm corn, fish, and live off the land. Out of gratitude, in 1621, Pilgrims and Native Americans shared a great feast together. This moment became the tradition we now know as Thanksgiving. So, Jamestown gave America its economic foundation, while Plymouth brought the ideals of religious freedom and self-government. Together, these two settlements laid the roots of what would later become the 13 colonies, and eventually, the United States itself. Why did thousands of people leave everything behind in Europe and risk a dangerous voyage across the Atlantic? The answer lies in three powerful motives: faith, fortune, and farmland. First, religion. In 16th and 17th century England, not everyone was free to worship as they wished. Groups like the Puritans and the Pilgrims were persecuted for their beliefs. To them, America represented hope, a place where they could finally build a community rooted in their own faith, free from the king's control. For these settlers, crossing the ocean wasn't just about survival, it was about the freedom of the soul. Second, trade and wealth. Across Europe, merchants and investors saw the New World as a golden opportunity. Colonies meant access to new resources: tobacco, timber, furs, and later cotton, that could be sold back in Europe for huge profits. Companies like the Virginia Company sponsored entire settlements, hoping to strike it rich. For many adventurers, America was the land of fortune, a place where even a poor man could dream of becoming wealthy. And third, land. In crowded England, farmland was scarce and expensive. Ordinary families had little chance of owning property. But in America, there seemed to be endless land, fertile fields, forests, and rivers waiting to be claimed. For settlers, land meant independence, security, and a chance to build a future for their children. So while some came chasing God, others came chasing gold, or simply a small piece of ground to call their own. Together, these motives filled the ships that crossed the Atlantic. They built settlements that would eventually grow into the 13 colonies. In the end, it was this mix of religion, trade, and land hunger that gave birth to a new society. And from those motives, a nation began to take shape. In the early 1600s, a wave of settlers began arriving in the northern part of America. These were the Pilgrims and the Puritans, people who wanted something very simple, yet very powerful: the freedom to live and worship on their own terms. The Pilgrims had already made history at Plymouth in 1620. But just a decade later, thousands more Puritans followed, settling in what became the Massachusetts Bay Colony. To them, New England was more than just land, it was a city upon a hill, a model community that would shine with faith and discipline. Life was strict. Hard work, church attendance, and moral order were at the center of everything. Town meetings became a hallmark of New England life, giving ordinary men a voice in their local government. But not everyone agreed with the Puritan way. Some believed their leaders were too rigid, too controlling. Out of this conflict came new colonies. Roger Williams, a minister who argued for religious tolerance, was banished from Massachusetts. He founded Rhode Island, a place where people of all beliefs could live side by side. And Hutchinson, another dissenter, also found refuge there after challenging Puritan leaders. Rhode Island quickly became a symbol of freedom and diversity in a world that was still learning how to tolerate differences. Meanwhile, Connecticut and New Hampshire grew as more settlers pushed outward, drawn by farmland and trade. The rocky soil and harsh winters of New England meant large-scale farming was difficult, but families survived through small farms, fishing, lumber, and shipbuilding. The coastline became busy with trade, linking New England to Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa. Together, these New England colonies built communities that were tight-knit, deeply religious, and self-governing. Their emphasis on education, town meetings, and moral order left a lasting mark on American identity. The Pilgrims had planted the seed, the Puritans shaped its form, and dissenters like Roger Williams gave. If New England was known for faith and community, the Middle Colonies were known for something else: diversity. It all began with the Dutch. In 1624, they established New Amsterdam at the mouth of the Hudson River. It quickly became a bustling port full of traders, farmers, and people from many nations. But in 1664, the English captured it and renamed it New York. Under English rule, New York grew even faster, its harbor filled with ships, its streets alive with merchants from around the world. To the west, another experiment was taking shape. In 1681, King Charles II granted land to William Penn, a Quaker. Penn dreamed of a colony built on peace, tolerance, and equality. He called it Pennsylvania. Here, Quakers, Germans, Dutch, Irish, and others lived side by side. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, became one of the most important cities in colonial America, a hub of trade, ideas, and politics. Unlike the rocky soil of New England, the Middle Colonies had fertile land. Wheat, corn, and oats grew in abundance, earning the region the nickname, the breadbasket colonies. At the same time, the rivers and ports supported a thriving trade. Farmers, artisans, and merchants all found opportunities to prosper. But what truly set the Middle Colonies apart was their mix of cultures and religions. Protestants, Catholics, Quakers, Jews, all could practice their faith more freely here than almost anywhere else in the colonies. In towns and markets, dozens of languages could be heard. This cultural blend created a spirit of tolerance and cooperation that would later influence the entire nation. By the 1700s, the Middle Colonies stood as a bridge between North and South, combining the trade of New England with the rich farmlands of the South. They were prosperous, diverse, and dynamic, embodying the idea that America could be a home for many different people, living and working together. The story of the Middle Colonies is the story of opportunity, and the beginning of AM. While New England was shaped by faith, and the Middle Colonies by diversity, the Southern colonies were built on land, vast, fertile land that gave rise to powerful plantations and a way of life unlike anywhere else in America. It all started with Virginia, the first successful English colony. Tobacco quickly became its lifeline. Known as brown gold, tobacco was exported across the Atlantic, making planters rich and tying Virginia's economy to Europe. But growing it required endless labor, and that demand would soon shape the entire South. Next came Maryland, founded in 1634 by Lord Baltimore as a refuge for English Catholics. While Virginia was dominated by the Anglican Church, Maryland offered a safe haven for Catholics who faced discrimination back home. The colony also prospered through tobacco, but its legacy lay in its early attempts at religious tolerance. Farther south, the Carolinas emerged. At first they were one colony, later splitting into North and South. South Carolina developed a plantation system that thrived on rice and indigo, crops well suited to its swampy lowlands. Enslaved Africans brought not only their labor but also vital knowledge of rice cultivation, shaping the colony's economy and culture. North Carolina, by contrast, grew more slowly. Its people were often small farmers, hunters, and traders, living with fewer wealthy elites. Finally came Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies, founded in 1732. It was envisioned by James Oglethorpe as a fresh start for debtors and the poor, and also as a buffer zone against Spanish Florida. Though idealistic at first, banning slavery and alcohol, the bans didn't last long. Georgia, like its neighbors, became part of the plantation economy. What truly united the southern colonies was their reliance on plantations. These were massive estates producing tobacco, rice, and indigo for export. At the heart of this system was slavery. By the late 1600s, indentured servitude gave way to the widespread use. The story of the American colonies was not just about survival. It was about building an economy from the ground up. And from New England to the South, each region found its own way to thrive. In New England, the rocky soil made large-scale farming nearly impossible. Instead, colonists turned to the sea. They built small farms for corn and vegetables, but their real strength was in shipbuilding, fishing, and trade. New England's harbors bustled with ships carrying lumber, fish, and rum across the Atlantic. Towns like Boston grew into centers of commerce and craftsmanship. In the middle colonies, the fertile soil and milder climate earned them the name, the breadbasket colonies. Farmers produced wheat, oats, and barley in abundance. These grains were exported to feed not just the colonies but also people in Europe and the Caribbean. Alongside farming, bustling cities like New York and Philadelphia became hubs of trade, where merchants dealt in everything from furs to manufactured goods. And in the southern colonies, the economy was dominated by large plantations. Tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, rice and indigo in the Carolinas and Georgia. These cash crops were grown on a massive scale. The plantation system made the South wealthy, but it depended heavily on enslaved labor, creating deep divisions in colonial society. Holding all of this together was the triangular trade system. Ships sailed from New England carrying rum and goods to Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved people. Those captives were forced across the Atlantic in the brutal Middle Passage, taken to the Caribbean and the southern colonies. There, their labor produced sugar, tobacco, and other goods that were shipped back to Europe, and the cycle continued. It was global, it was profitable, and it was cruel. By the 1700s, the colonial economy had become a web of farming, trade, and industry, stretching across oceans. From a fisherman in Massachusetts, to a wheat farmer in Pennsylvania to a. In the early days of the American colonies, one of the biggest challenges was simple: who would do the work? Clearing forests, building towns, and farming tobacco or rice required endless labor. At first, the solution came through a system called indentured servitude. Indentured servants were mostly poor Europeans. They signed contracts to work for a master in the colonies for 4, 5, sometimes even 7 years. In exchange, they received passage across the Atlantic, food, and shelter. For many, it was a chance to escape poverty in England and hope for a new life in America. Once their time was up, some earned land or freedom to start fresh. But for others, the years of backbreaking labor brought only exhaustion, illness, and death. Yet as the colonies grew, indentured servants were not enough. The demand for labor, especially on southern plantations, kept rising. And so, by the mid-1600s, colonists turned increasingly to a darker system: slavery. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, but in the decades that followed, the trade exploded. Unlike indentured servants, enslaved people had no contract, no end date, no chance at freedom. They were considered property, bought and sold, families torn apart, lives controlled completely by their owners. The journey itself was horrific. Captured in Africa, men, women, and children were forced onto ships in the Middle Passage across the Atlantic. Crammed together in chains, thousands died before ever reaching America. Those who survived were sold in markets from the Caribbean to the Carolinas, condemned to a lifetime of labor in fields of tobacco, rice, and later cotton. By the 1700s, slavery had become the backbone of the Southern economy. Plantations grew rich on the forced labor of Africans, while Northern merchants profited from the trade that supplied it. The system was brutal, but it was deeply entrenched in colonial life. Indentured servitude had opened the door to labor in America, but slavery, yes. When English settlers first crossed the Atlantic, they didn't just bring tools and supplies, they also carried with them ideas about government. But in the New World, those ideas would begin to change. The earliest example came in 1619 in Virginia, with the creation of the House of Burgesses. It was the first elected assembly in America. For the first time, colonists had a voice in making laws and managing local affairs. This spirit of self-rule spread quickly. In New England towns, citizens gathered in town meetings, where free men debated, voted, and decided community matters directly. It was government by the people, at least by the men who were allowed to participate. Still, the colonies were not independent nations. They remained under the authority of the English crown. Governors were often appointed by the king, and royal officials made sure that British interests came first. The colonies had freedom in local matters, but when it came to trade, taxes, or loyalty to the empire, London always expected control. This created a unique balance. On one side, colonists enjoyed a taste of democracy through assemblies, councils, and town meetings. On the other side, they were constantly reminded of British power, through royal governors, laws, and the king's authority. Sometimes these two forces worked together. But often they clashed. Colonists wanted to decide how to spend their own taxes, while governors insisted on following orders from England. Merchants wanted free trade, while Britain demanded restrictions to protect its own economy. By the 1700s, this tension had created something new in America, a belief that people had the right to govern themselves. Colonists were loyal to the king, but they had also built a tradition of self-rule that felt too valuable to give up. The colonial government was, in many ways, a training ground. It taught Americans how to debate, how to vote, and how to push back against authority. And when conflict with Britain finally ceased, what was life really like in the American colonies? Beyond the ships, trade, and governments, the story of colonial America was lived day by day, in homes, schools, churches, and towns. For most families, life centered on the home and the farm. In New England and the Middle Colonies, households worked together, fathers in the fields, mothers managing food and clothing, children helping with chores from a very young age. In the South, wealthy plantation families lived in large houses with enslaved laborers doing much of the work, while smaller farmers lived more modestly. Church played a central role. In New England, Puritans expected strict attendance and long sermons, shaping community rules and morals. In the Middle Colonies, with their mix of faiths, Quakers, Catholics, Lutherans, Jews, worship was more diverse, reflecting the region's cultural blend. The South, too, centered life around churches, though scattered farms meant gatherings were less frequent. Wherever you lived, Sunday was not just a day of rest, but a day of community. Education was another pillar, though it varied widely. In New England, towns valued literacy so children could read the Bible. Schools were simple, often one-room buildings, where boys, and sometimes girls, learned to read, write, and do arithmetic. In the Middle and Southern colonies, formal schooling was less common. Wealthy families hired tutors, while poorer children learned skills at home or through apprenticeships. For enslaved children, education was almost always forbidden. Society itself was layered. At the top were wealthy merchants, landowners, or planters who held most of the power. Below them were small farmers, craftsmen, and laborers. Indentured servants and enslaved Africans formed the bottom of this social pyramid. Yet despite the divisions, colonial towns and villages often came together for markets, festivals, and local gatherings, moments that gave a sense of community in a challenging world. Daily colonial life was. For more than a century, the American colonies had grown and prospered. They built farms, towns, and trade networks, largely managing their own affairs. But by the mid-1700s, Britain began to tighten its grip. And that's when tensions started to boil. It began with taxation. After costly wars in Europe and North America, Britain looked to the colonies to help pay the bills. Parliament passed the Stamp Act of 1765, requiring colonists to pay taxes on paper, newspapers, and even playing cards. The colonists were outraged. Their cry was simple but powerful. No taxation without representation. They argued that since they had no representatives in Parliament, Britain had no right to tax them. Next came trade restrictions. Through the Navigation Acts, Britain forced the colonies to trade only with English ships and markets. Goods like tobacco and sugar could be sold only to Britain, cutting off free trade with other nations. Colonists began smuggling to get around the rules, fueling more resentment against British control. Protests grew louder. In 1770, tensions exploded in the Boston Massacre, when British soldiers fired on a crowd, killing 5 colonists. Just 3 years later, anger over attacks on tea led to the famous Boston Tea Party, where colonists dumped British tea into the harbor in defiance. Britain responded with the Intolerable Acts, harsh laws that punished Massachusetts and placed even tighter control on colonial life. But instead of breaking the colonies, these acts united them. Delegates from across America gathered in the First Continental Congress, declaring that their rights were being trampled. What began as protests over taxes and trade was turning into something larger, a fight for liberty. Colonists had grown used to running their own assemblies, governing their own towns, and building their own economy. Now, they began to imagine independence. By the 1770s, the gap between Britain and its colonies had become a chasm. From taxation to rebellion,